During the height of the Second World War in early 1943, a train pulled into a sleepy station in eastern Poland between Warsaw and Białystok. The ravages of war had seemingly passed this place by. The train was packed with people. They were apprehensive and scared, having been forcibly uprooted from the ghettos of the big cities with the promises of resettlement in the east. They had with them only what they could carry. The rest of their possessions had to be left behind. They had come from one of the many Jewish ghettos dotted around Poland. As the densely packed train unloaded its human cargo, the people looked at their new surroundings. Most had probably never been here before, or ever dreamed of such a place, given the horror and squalor of the ghettos. This place had flowers in hanging baskets, train timetables on the wall, light music being piped in from a PA system, and an ornate antique station clock, and all surrounded by tall trees. It must have seemed to them like they had finally been handed some good luck. At last, this place was almost idyllic. Little did any of them know that within the hour, between 95 to 99% of them would all be dead. It turned out the station was merely a facade, for waiting for them out of view was nothing short of a killing factory. As they were chivied down the station ramp by the shouting guards, they looked at the name on the sign. The name of this place has passed into infamy. Treblinka. Unlike the more well-known Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka was a much smaller affair, barely covering about 30 to 40 acres, compared to the vast expanse of its much more infamous sister. But it didn't need to be, for Treblinka was designed with only one function in mind: efficient mass murder. It would only be operational for 15 months, but in that time, Treblinka would cruelly claim the lives of just under 1 million innocent people, second only to Auschwitz. Of all those sent there, it is known that only 86 people would survive. Today, we take a deep dive into the sheer horror of industrial-scale murder in Treblinka, the road to heaven. Winding the clock back to the opening days of 1942 and far away from the then unknown Treblinka, a secret meeting took place at a well-appointed villa in the Berlin borough of Wannsee. The conference was highly secret and not mentioned in any official documentation. However, minutes taken at the meeting allow us to know exactly who was there and what was said. In attendance at this meeting were some of the highest-ranking Nazis of the infamous Schutzstaffel, or SS. In attendance was Heinrich Müller, head of the Geheime Staatspolizei, the infamous Gestapo, SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, the head of the Department for Jewish Affairs, and the meeting's chairman, director of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, or Reich Security Main Office, Reinhard Heydrich. They were there to discuss the single item on the agenda, die Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution to the Jewish question. The Jews of Germany had been moved to the 6 concentration and forced labour camps inside of Germany, names such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Ravensbrück. In Poland, the Jews had been forced from their homes and corralled into gigantic, cramped walled ghettos that were far too small for the sheer number of people. All of this had been done with the express purpose of freeing up Lebensraum, or living space, for what the Nazis considered to be pure-blood German citizens. The anti-Semitic views of the Nazis had provided further motivation to treat the Jews appallingly, as they were seen as Untermensch, or subhuman. Many thousands had already died in these appalling conditions, either through starvation, disease, summary executions, or being literally worked to death as slave labour. Displacement to areas further east was considered. Before the war, Eichmann had even made a visit to what is now Israel with the view of studying the feasibility of relocating Europe's Jews there. Eventually, these ideas were discarded in favour of a much more extreme answer. The meeting had decided upon the mass extermination of every single Jew in German-occupied territory and any new territories they conquered going forward. This would be conducted at centralized facilities inside of the current concentration camp system, which would need to be vastly expanded to accommodate the genocide. And whilst they were at it, they could also use this to permanently rid themselves of the other perceived enemies of the state: Soviet POWs, Slavs, Roma, homosexuals, and the disabled, along with political prisoners. The already existing camps at Chelmno and Majdanek and Auschwitz would need to be greatly expanded to incorporate a new extermination camp, and 3 further sites were selected for brand new camps. These would be at Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka. Up until this point, all newly captured regions would have their Jews purged by the 7 Einsatzgruppen, or task groups, that shadowed the advancing arms of the Wehrmacht during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Around 3,000 strong, the Einsatzgruppen consists of men hastily assembled in 1939 by Heydrich from the various Reich security and police forces and the Waffen-SS. They would swoop into towns and villages, round up all suspected Jews and communists, lead them to nearby secluded areas. Here they would be forced to dig a huge trench. Then the groups would be herded in and shot. The trench would then be filled in, and the Einsatzgruppen would move on to the next settlement. In this way, by December 1941, the month before the Wannsee Conference, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered just under 450,000 people, declaring the various areas in which they operated, quote, completely free of Jews. Due to the nature of their activities, the members of the Einsatzgruppen suffered severe mental problems and had to be rotated out very regularly. Of course, these mental health issues were not fully understood at the time, but it was at least known that the men were indeed suffering badly from an extreme version of shell shock, or what we would now refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder. Himmler had witnessed one of these mass executions firsthand, and was thoroughly appalled by it. Having never served in combat before, Himmler was not used to seeing the act of killing, or the dead. He was so shaken by the experience, and he was determined to find a much more efficient method that detached the act of killing from the individual as much as possible. This is what had directly led to the Wannsee Conference. Following Reinhard Heydrich's assassination in Prague a few months after Wannsee, on the 4th of June 1942, the Nazi High Command and Heydrich's successor Ernst Kaltenbrunner would rename the whole murderous adventure after the dashing officer and its most vehement proponent. Action Reinhard was born. The labour camp at Treblinka was the first to be built and had been established in September 1941. The camp was centred around a pre-existing large stone quarry. The quarry was seized by the Reich as a means of providing hard core for roads and blocks for buildings. The addition of accommodation blocks and barbed wire fencing was all that was really needed to complete the basics of the work camp. The camp inmates were sent there on the pretext of being sentenced to a predetermined amount of time, but most were detained indefinitely. Slave labour played a major role in production for the Reich in all industries. The camp was administered throughout by SS Sturmbannführer Theodor von Eupen, along with a small contingent of SS and around 100 Travnicki guards. Von Eupen, like his contemporaries, ruled his camp with an iron fist. Any infraction of the rules, no matter how arbitrary, would be severely punished, with a combination of beatings, withdrawal of the already meagre food and water rations, or even on-the-spot execution. Von Eupen being known to take particularly ghoulish pride in shooting prisoners with his pistol as they passed him for no reason at all. In early April 1942, construction began on the second camp. This would be the Vernichtungslager, or extermination camp. When Treblinka I was established, the labour camp inmates would be required to cut down trees from the surrounding forest to feed the ever-hungry cremation pyres of the new camp. Treblinka I only consisted of 4 separate areas, the first being the Wohnlager, the accommodation and administration blocks for the camp guards. Once the unsuspecting people had been led down the station ramp and walked around to the back of the station building, they would enter a gigantic courtyard, the Auffanglager, or reception area. Here, the men would be separated from the women and children. The men who were judged to be sufficiently fit and healthy would be further divided from the crowd. The sick, disabled, and lame were also filtered out. A roll call was then taken, the list of people deported from the ghettos having been sent with the train. Some had not survived the slow 50-mile journey due to the cramped cattle wagons, with no room to sit down. The weaker passengers simply could not cope, and had died standing up, finally collapsing as the still living relieved the crush as they climbed down from the wagons. Once the names were tallied up with the manifest, the new arrivals were told that they had arrived at a transit camp, a brief stop on their way to a work camp, but before they could continue they had to be washed and their clothes disinfected to stop the spread of dirt and disease before they could be taken on to their new homes. The separated groups of people would then be told to leave their luggage and belongings in the courtyard, and then led through to the next section of the camp. The next section involved the guards telling the prisoners to surrender any cash they had on them for safekeeping in exchange for a receipt which they could redeem later. Of course, this was a lie. Next, everyone had their heads shaved on the auspices of eliminating lice. After this, they were ordered to strip completely. When everyone stood naked and no doubt embarrassed, afraid, and vulnerable, the guards told them that they were to move on to the next section, where they would be given a shower. Dirt, grime, and stink were a major problem because of the squalid conditions in which they had been living in previously in the ghettos. They were all under the impression that they would soon be dressed again, after having a much-needed clean. The guards then drove the naked procession down a heavily wooded path that led, around to the right, in an inverted J shape around the back of the Auffanglager. This short walk would be the last they ever took, for the final section of the camp was the Totenlager, the death camp. The guards referred to this one-way footpath as der Schlauch, or the Tube. However, it soon gained a much more sickening nickname, die Himmelstrasse, the road to heaven. The Totenlager was hidden behind a surrounding high earthen bank and dense trees to obscure it from view. Immediately the men would be forced into a large, long building. The door would be closed behind them, and the men left completely in the dark. Outside, a faint sound of an engine being started. Unlike the more well-known Zyklon B pesticide used at Majdanek and Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka used a slightly less advanced method that was first developed during the mass euthanasia project Action T4, just before the start of the war, and expanded at the Chelmno death camp. Treblinka's victims were gassed with carbon monoxide from exhaust of a captured Soviet army tank engine that was piped directly into the building. Carbon monoxide is more dense than air, so the gas filled the chamber from the ground up, the same way that water would. This invisible, colourless and odourless gas would first affect the shortest members of the crowd. They began to seemingly choke on nothing, coughing uncontrollably and gasping for air. However, the more they gasped, the more of the deadly gas they inhaled, forcing the oxygen from their system and hastening their demise. The taller ones would have only just begun to recognize what was happening as the gas began to reach their lungs too. Panic would have no doubt ensued, screaming with their last breaths and scrabbling around for a way out. A way out they would never find. As the gas cruelly choked its victims and their grip on life slowly ebbed, the women and children waiting outside could hear everything. As they in turn began to panic, the guards would bark orders for silence. Within minutes, the screams inside had fallen silent. After around 15 to 20 minutes, it was all over. Doors on the other side of the building were opened and the gas allowed to escape for around a minute or two. After this, another group of camp prisoners would enter. These were the men of the euphemistically termed Sonderkommando, the special unit. Their job was to drag the lifeless corpses out of the gas chamber and prepare them for mass cremation. Once the dead had been removed, the doors were sealed again, and the signal given to send in the women and children. Again, unlike Birkenau, Treblinka had no purpose-built crematoria attached to the gas chambers. Instead, the dead were disposed of by stacking them in a gigantic pit with an iron grate at the bottom. The layer of bodies would be alternated with a layer of wood that was cut by the forced labourers of Treblinka I. Once the mass funeral pyre was ready, it was doused in kerosene, petrol or diesel, and set alight. For the next 2 to 4 hours, a thick, black pall of acrid smoke billowed into the air above the camp that could be seen for miles around. The Sonderkommando wore rags tied around their faces to try and shield their lungs from the smoke and their noses from the stench of roasting flesh, and tried to ignore the awful sound of fat rendering and sizzling in the inferno, and looked away from the bodies of their kin as the corpses contorted in the intense heat. Once the fire had died down, the ashes were shoveled into one of 3 huge pits dug out by an on-site mechanical shovel. The men of the Sonderkommando were selected from the incoming transports. They were amongst the most fit, healthy and strong, but although they would not be sent immediately to their deaths, it was merely a stay of execution. The Sonderkommandos would be literally worked to death. Suicide rates were extremely high. Of the 120 or so Sonderkommando assigned to the Totenlager at any one time, as many as 20 would kill themselves every single day, rather than face their horrid tasks. The guards didn't care. There would be replacements to select from the next transport that arrived. And arrive they did, twice a day, 6 days a week, regular as clockwork. At its height, Treblinka I could process as many as 15,000 prisoners a day. Whilst the killing and cremations were taking place, another group of Sonderkommando were hard at work sorting through the possessions brought in on the transports. This group would be nicknamed Geldjuden, the Gold Jews. The clothes that people were wearing would have still been warm, as their pockets were searched through and the seams and linings checked for extra hidden goodies, as well as removing the yellow Star of David from each of them. As they were only allowed to take with them what they could carry, Jewish prisoners that had any hidden wealth usually kept it about their person in the shape of paper currencies, precious stones and metals. In this way, throughout the entire Reich, literally billions in wealth was stolen from Europe's Jews. The dead's belongings were thoroughly rifled through and sorted. These spoils were all supposed to be sent back to Germany to be utilized and redistributed. Even the hair from the shaven heads of the women were baled up and sent to factories for use in things such as stuffing mattresses and, scandalously, even woven into socks for sailors of the Kriegsmarine U-boat crews. Of course, some of the more unscrupulous officers and guards would skim a few things that took their fancy, nice clothes, for example, as well as the plundered wealth. It was known that the members of the Sonderkommando could also secretly enrich themselves. However, if they were caught with so much as a penny on their person, they could face a savage beating and execution at the hands of the sadistic guards. The guards themselves were not immune to punishment, running a huge risk by creaming off some wealth themselves. If caught by higher command, a guard could be sacked and imprisoned for stealing from the Reich, as all Jewish property was considered to be forfeit directly to the Reich and should be sent back to the main security office in Germany. The Germans assigned to all the concentration and death camps were of the SS Totenkopfverbände, or Death's Head Unit. However, the numbers of these guards were not that great. The SS had great difficulty in gaining volunteers from their officially limited pool of acceptable Aryan bloodlines. To sidestep this, Heinrich Himmler had ordered that new volunteers would be accepted from the captured regions in the east. Here, they found a huge number of willing volunteers who were not only anti-Soviet, but also largely anti-Semitic. none were more so vehement in their extreme views than those from Ukraine and Byelorussia. Even some Soviet POWs were recruited. These volunteers would wear the same basic insignia as the SS, but would be directly subordinate to them, acting almost as a tier of middle management. They were to be trained at the concentration camp in Treblinka. This would also gain this group the same name. Their training involved learning German and honing their skills in the art of savagery on groups of real prisoners. The Treblinkis were greatly feared for their extreme brutality, even for the most minor of perceived infractions or mere arbitrary will. They were armed with rifles and pistols, and most also carried bullwhips and riding crops for dishing out random punishments. The most feared of the Treblinka guards at Treblinka was Ivan Marchenko, known as Ivan Grozny, the Terrible, after the moniker of the infamous Russian Tsar Ivan IV. This Ukrainian man would stalk up and down the lines of prisoners as they waited for their turn in the gas chamber, assaulting and killing randomly. For this, he carried an iron bar and a sword. He was known for savagely cutting women's breasts off, or the genitalia of men with a single upsweep of the sword, and even laying open the abdomens of pregnant women. Another equally feared guard was SS member Willy Mentz, nicknamed Frankenstein because of his choice of attire being a doctor's white lab coat. His job was to deal with the new arrivals that were too weak or feeble to keep up with the others, or the ones that resisted too much. These prisoners would be taken to a separate block disguised as an infirmary that, once through the door, opened out onto a large pit around 7 meters deep. They would be lined up along the edge of the pit, and Frankenstein would simply make his way down the line and coldly put a bullet in the back of their heads, whilst an assistant, who followed close behind, made sure they fell forward into the pit. In this way, Mentz would be personally responsible for the murder of thousands, although it could be perhaps macabrely argued that maybe their deaths were a little easier compared to those of the gas chambers. An unforgettable sight at the camp was the towering presence of SS guard Max Möller. Originally a policeman before joining the SS, Möller gained the nickname of Der Amerikaner, the American, due to his great height and broad muscular frame. Möller was usually designed to the undressing yard, but was also known to assist Frankenstein and his superior August Miete in the fake hospital block. He also watched over the camp's small armory containing rifles, pistols, submachine guns, and hand grenades. Under the Travnikis would be a group of Jews called kapos. They were selected from the prisoners to help keep order. They would be expected to behave viciously towards their fellow Jews if they stepped out of line. Kapos were treated slightly better than the rest of the prisoners, but sooner or later they too would also be sent to be gassed. Once the camp was completed, the infamous trains began to arrive, each carrying anywhere between 4,000 to 7,000 people. Treblinka's trains came from Warsaw, Lublin, Radom, and Bialystok, with some overlap as numbers thinned at each location. In addition to this, a further 20,000 are known to have come from outside Poland, such as Bohemia and Moravia and Bulgarian-occupied Macedonia. The ones from the former arriving in proper passenger carriages with a lot more luggage than usual, and the trains even being well supplied with good quality food, such as cured meats, cheeses, alcohol, coffee, tea, candy. No doubt the guards were ecstatic at such great finds. Lord knows its intended consumers wouldn't be getting any of it. A further 2,000 victims were of Romani descent, although the population of Roma in the ghettos was far more numerous than this at around 30,000. A lot of the time, rather than being transported with the Jews, were simply shot on the spot. The extermination camp was initially overseen by a doctor, the only camp to be so. SS Sturmbannführer Dr. Irmfried Eberl. The Austrian-born psychiatrist Eberl had been a part of Action T4 at Bernberg Hospital and had impressed his superiors sufficiently to oversee the efficiency of the camp. Unfortunately for him, either through overconfidence or incompetence, The sheer number of daily new arrivals had proven too overwhelming, with dead prisoners littering nearly the whole camp, even on the railway platform. This had come about because the platform was not long enough to accommodate the whole length of the 60-wagon-long train. The train would have had to be shunted 3 separate times to discharge all of its passengers. During this agonizingly long waiting time, some prisoners would be overcome in the summer heat and had already died by the time their wagon was due to be unloaded. Odilo Globoknik, the head of the Reichsinspectorate of concentration camps, had gotten wind of the problems at Treblinka II and had made a surprise visit in late August 1942. He was utterly appalled at the state of the camp, not because of its brutality, of course, but the fact that Eberl had clearly failed to live up to the expectations of efficiency. This was too much for Globoknik. He sacked Eberl on the spot and replaced him with Franz Stangl. Arriving 5 days later, Franz Stangl had a proven track record of efficiency and experience that he had gained at the Sobibor death camp. When he arrived on the 1st of September 1942, he noted, quote, "The road ran alongside the railway. When we were about 15-20 minutes' drive from Treblinka, we began to see corpses by the line, first just 2 or 3, then more, and as we drove into Treblinka station, there were what looked like hundreds of them, just lying there. They had obviously been there for days in the heat. In the station was a train full of Jews, some dead, some still alive. That, too, looked as if it had been there for days." End quote. Stangl wasted no time in cleaning up the camp. He drafted in extra Sonderkommando to clear the huge backlog of bodies that still lay rotting in the heat, and of course process the new arrivals. Naturally, when this was finished, the trains began to run again, bringing more and more unsuspecting victims to their inevitable fate. Stangl took a bit of a back seat to the proceedings at Treblinka once he had restored order, being rarely seen by the prisoners. On the rare occasions he was seen, he would usually be in a white SS uniform, far removed from the black or Wehrmacht green that the SS usually wore. This led him to acquiring the nickname, the White Death. Following a large uprising by the Sonderkommando, a huge cover-up was instigated, even attempting to hide the news from Berlin as no official reports were submitted. Globoknik forwarded a message to Treblinka that due to the Russian advance, Aktion Reinhardt was to cease that October, and Stangl would be recalled to Trieste in Italy to help root out Italian partisan groups. This left the camp under the command of SS Untersturmführer Kurt Franz, nicknamed the Doll by the prisoners for his chiselled and dashing good looks. Franz was much more brutal than his predecessor, dishing out beatings with his own hands and setting his giant St. Bernard dog Barry on prisoners by uttering the sick order, "Mensch, fass den Hund!" or "Man, grab that dog!" further reiterating the dehumanization of the Jewish people by switching the roles of Barry and his victim. To add further humiliation to the inmates, Franz penned a song that he forced everyone to sing at morning roll call. The melody was taken from a similar song sung at Buchenwald in the key of D major. The translated lyrics were as follows, quote, "Looking squarely ahead, brave and joyous at the world. The squads march to work. All that matters to us now is Treblinka. It is our destiny. That's why we've become one with Treblinka in no time at all. We know only the word of our commander. We know only obedience and duty. We want to serve, to go on serving until a little luck smiles on us again. Hooray!" Unquote. Franz started a small photo collection of the camp that was expressly forbidden by the SS, but because of this, we have a valuable record of what the camp looked like before it was liquidated. He titled the album Schöne Zeiten, Good Times. By early 1943, a small group of camp inmates had organized themselves into a resistance movement with a view to seeking an escape, destroying as much as they could and killing as many guards as possible during the process. The only other possible method of escape open to individuals was to disappear from a work detail that worked outside the perimeter fencing. However, this would only result in swift and severe reprisals against the remaining people of the detail, and therefore was quietly discouraged. although it did occasionally happen here and there with varying degrees of success. Thus, the more violent option was seen as the only way to increase the chances to escape for a greater number of people. After a large number of trustworthy inmates were recruited to the group, the eventual plan for escape began to take shape. Materials were discreetly gathered for the task, such as small quantities of petrol for setting buildings on fire, tools that could be utilized as weapons such as shovels, axes, picks, and wooden handles. Other pieces of wood that were found that could be used to pry apart the barbed wire fencing, but the real prize that the group knew that they would need for this escape was going to work was firearms and explosives. They knew exactly where they could be found, but getting to them would necessitate some clever trickery. The lock on the armory door was deliberately sabotaged, which prompted the guards to send for the resident locksmith, who just so happened to be part of the resistance group. Whilst the guards were distracted by other inmates, possibly by a member of the work detail assigned to the sorting sheds, with some nice clothing or trinkets that they had snuck out. The locksmith replaced the lock on the armory door and made a second copy of the key. A plan thus readied, the date of rebellion was set for the evening of Monday the 2nd of August, 1943. By 4 p.m, much of the plan was ready. The armory had been looted and arms distributed. All was going fine, until SS officer Kurt Kuttner caught one of the main conspirators with a small quantity of gold that he had hidden away for after his escape. The remaining members decided to act immediately rather than sit and watch their comrade punished and shot. Of the 840 inmates of the camp on that day, only 105 did not participate. However, the entire camp seemed to descend into instant chaos, with gunfire, explosions, and fires breaking out in all directions. The guards were in disarray, but some managed to compose themselves and organize pockets of resistance. The small area of the camp made the overall effort difficult, as most places were within easy range of rifle and heavy machine gun fire. Despite all of this, around 100 people managed to breach the fence and escape to the woods beyond, being chased by men, dogs, and bullets the whole way. The breakout attempt had lasted around 20 to 30 minutes. Around a third were captured over the next few hours and were brutally tortured and killed. This effort represented the largest number of Treblinka escapees, the rest being made up of individual attempts. Once the order for the destruction of the camp were issued, the process progressed very quickly. The last few transports from the Bialystok ghetto arrived and were quickly disposed of. The very last transport, consisting of 39 wagons, arrived at Treblinka II on the 23rd of August 1943. On the 17th of November that year, the remnants of the camp were finally gone, the final task being the 25 to 30 remaining Sonderkommando, who were summarily shot. In the end, all that was left of Treblinka II was the newly constructed farmhouse built on the site of the camp bakery from the bricks of the former gas chambers, and an empty void in the trees. Every last shred of evidence of one of the largest killing factories ever conceived by man was all but ploughed into the ground, along with the ashes of its near 1 million innocent victims. It is easy to forget the existence of Treblinka, mostly because of the lack of anything original left at the site. The advance of the Red Army meant that a place like Auschwitz was simply too difficult to attempt to erase. The SS were sure to blow up the gas chambers and some of the accommodation blocks, but the rest of the camp was largely intact. With Treblinka, the only proof that it were ever there being in the paperwork of the Reich, a few illicit photographs, and the heart-wrenching testimonies of its handful of survivors and the reluctant confessions of its guards. The disgusting monster that was Ivan the Terrible was thought to have been identified. A Ukrainian expat living in the USA by the name of John Demyanyuk was positively identified by Treblinka survivors as being the infamous Trebniki Guard. Whilst it was firmly established by the publication of his SS ID card that Demyanyuk worked at the Sobibor camp, he was insistent, however, that he did not have anything to do with the gas chambers or the direct murder of any of the inmates. Demjanjuk was extradited to Israel and put on trial in 1986. One of the survivors from Treblinka became a key witness for the prosecution after she was put on the stand and asked if she could identify the defendant. Eliyahu Rosenberg approached him and asked him to lower his glasses. Demjanjuk did so, smiled and offered his hand. Upon getting close enough and looking into his eyes, she instantly recoiled and screamed, "Grozny! Ivan Grozny!" and "How dare you put out your hand, murderer that you are!" A damning testimony. In addition to this, on his US immigration visa application, Demjanjuk had put down his mother's maiden name as Marchenko. However, he stated that this was because he had forgotten the real answer and simply put a common Ukrainian surname. Perhaps a rather dubious excuse, as I personally find it hard to believe that someone would forget their mother's maiden name, but doesn't mean to say it couldn't have happened. Strangely enough, it was only in relation to Treblinka that Demjanjuk was tried. No charges were pursued in relation to Sobibor, despite that this would have been far easier to prove, but it is likely that by attempting to prove that he was Ivan the Terrible, would almost have certainly receive the death penalty, and on the 18th of April 1988, that's exactly what happened. Demjanjuk was sentenced to hang. However, in 1993, a panel of 5 judges overturned the conviction. They did not disagree with the courts as to the physical evidence, most notably the ID card, but there was too much reasonable doubt as to whether he really was Ivan the Terrible. Chief amongst this was the testimony of 37 guards identifying the infamous guard as Ivan Marchenko, not Demjanjuk. These testimonies were obtained by the Soviets after the war, with so many of those persons having already been executed. Even the famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal agreed with the judgment when it was published. Demjanjuk's freedom was only temporary, however, as he was extradited once again in July of 2009 to face another trial, this time in Germany. This second trial was on the rather flimsy charge that because Demjanjuk was a guard at Sobibor, he was guilty by association of murder. His defense attempted to argue that the principle of double jeopardy was infringed. However, this was struck down. On the 12th of May 2011, John Demjanjuk was found guilty of being an accessory to around 27,900 inmates of Sobibor and sentenced to 5 years in prison, considering the 2 he had already served. At this point, he was 91 years old. John Demjanjuk died on the 17th of March 2012. There is still much argument as to whether he was truly Ivan the Terrible, but now, ultimately, that point will forever remain moot. Willy Frankenstein Mentz was transferred to Sobibor for a short time following the liquidation of Treblinka, and from there being part of the SS force dealing with resistance and partisans. Following the end of the war, Mentz returned to the now West Germany, to his old job of a milkman. But this would not last, as Mentz was arrested 20 years later in 1965 and convicted of the direct complicity in the murder of 700,000 people, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was released in March 1978 due to ill health and died 3 months later. Max Moller disappeared after the war, and his eventual fate is not known, although quite how such a recognizable towering figure such as him could disappear is in itself quite almost impressive. Following his swift fall from grace, Dr. Imfred Eberl returned to civilian life, moving to Germany and continuing to practice medicine in the town of Blaubeuren in Württemberg. He was arrested in 1948, but hanged himself before he could face his accusers. Franz Stangl's story took him to Syria via one of the infamous rat lines assisted by the Vatican and the provision of a fake passport, staying there for 3 years. Later in 1951 he moved to Brazil and ended up working at Volkswagen's factory in São Bernardo do Campo. Incredibly, throughout this entire time he never used an assumed name, always going by his real name. It is astounding, therefore, that he evaded capture for so long. He would finally be arrested in 1967 after being tracked down by Simon Wiesenthal and extradited back to Germany, and was indicted for his role in the deaths of around 1 million people. Whilst he did not deny his role, he pathetically attempted to justify the lack of guilt by saying variously, quote, "My conscience is clear. I was simply doing my duty," end quote, and, quote, "What I had to do while I continued my efforts to get out was to limit my own actions to what I, in my own conscience, could answer for. At police training, they taught us that the definition of a crime must meet 4 requirements. There has to be a subject, an object, an action, and intent. If any of these 4 elements is missing, then we are not dealing with a punishable offence. I could apply this to my own situation. If the subject was the government, the object the Jews, and the action the gassing, I could tell myself that for me the 4th element, intent, I call it free will, was missing." End quote. It should come as little shock that the court did not accept this explanation, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Franz Stangl died on the 28th of June 1971 in Düsseldorf prison from heart failure. Time would also catch up to SS Untersturmführer Kurt Franz in 1965, when he was found guilty of the collective murder of around 300,000 people, with 35 specific acts of murder or violence against Jews sent to the camp. Naturally, he denied everything and tried to minimize his involvement during his time in command. His photo album was found amongst his possessions. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, eventually being released on compassionate grounds in 1993, finally dying in 1998. A far easier fate than that of many of his victims. His SS uniform is now on display at the New England Holocaust Institute and Museum of Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you so much for watching. I can thoroughly recommend the 3-part video on the Treblinka Rebellion by the very brilliant Dr. Mark Felton. I deliberately left the details of this event as a quick overview so that I could direct you to his work. Link in the description. Today, at the site of Treblinka, there is a memorial to its nearly 1 million victims, one of them being a large, flat, rectangular slab that is approximately the same size as one of the cremation pits. The scars of the Shoah can never be repaired, but we can at least learn from it and ensure that the events and the victims are never forgotten, and that anything remotely similar is never allowed to happen again. I shall leave you with the names or partial names of the 86 known survivors of this most heinous crime against humanity. Thank you once again for watching.